I enjoyed a video recently by Keith Woods on why he left Twitter, where he observed that people interested in politics online, often the majority of them, set up their desired ends, their political objectives, through an extension of their subjective preference. So ultimately, they're relying on a kind of moral egotism and not aspiring towards some objective concept of the good. This leaves them at a loss when it comes to justifying their preferred ends as against those of their interlocutors in debate. That's problematic if you want to ultimately win arguments and change minds. The best you can do with this kind of moral egotism is essentially rally people around you who already fundamentally share your values, which has its own uses, but for someone who's interested in the pursuit of truth in a deep sense, like I think Keith is, it's just not satisfying, and I think ultimately it can't work. We are at a place in human history where if we don't have a comprehensive system of thought guiding us in our setting up of our political systems, we are going to fail because there's simply too much going on in the world, and there are too many competitors with extremely robust political philosophies. We may disagree with certain tenets of mainstream liberalism or the ideas of the more technocratic-minded globalists, but they have huge bodies of work and they integrate empirical evidence, philosophical frameworks. It's not just argued through the basis of intuition and this moral egoism. In order to have a concept of the good, we have to have a concept of what the world is in the first place. We have to, in other words, have metaphysics in order to have a coherent system of ethics. So that's just to argue why I think it's useful engaging in philosophy, building a whole system of thought, seeking the truth. That's what will guide us to the right answer as to what we ought to do, which is ultimately the question ethically, right? So in that vein, I'm looking to explain my philosophy in greater depth to people. This works best in one-on-one conversations, and so I'll add in the description a link to the Discord. We're going to migrate from that platform, but feel free to reach out on the Discord, message Barbarossa in the Peer Academy Discord, and if you have questions about my system, go ahead and ask. I'm a Platonist, a monist. I take off from Schopenhauer in a lot of ways, and I tie it all in with modern physics, and there are a number of people on the internet and academics even who share my basic system in a loose form. There are similarities with the system of Chris Langen, Bernardo Kastrup, Johannes Ratz, who you should definitely check out on YouTube. But anyway, to start, not at the beginning, because I'm not sure that there is a true beginning pedagogically. You just have to basically observe how the system fits together. Epistemologically, I hold to a view similar to Quine's, an epistemological pragmatism that dictates that we have to choose between available hypotheses on the basis of available criteria. And how we conceive of adequate criteria when evaluating hypotheses itself can be modified by the theories that we choose. But we have to try our best, and I think the best criteria we can use are coherence, empirical consistency, and parsimony, in that order. First of all, the idea has to be consistent with itself. It then has to be consistent with the evidence, and then lastly, it has to be the most elegant solution that's consistent with both itself and the evidence. The reason for including parsimony, which someone like J. Dyer has to reject in order to maintain orthodoxy, is that if you don't include parsimony as a criteria, then any hypothesis or theory which is consistent and explains the evidence can then be modified, augmented with additional postulate J, which does nothing in terms of explanatory power, but which complexifies the theory. If there's no added benefit in explanatory power, then there's no reason to multiply entities beyond necessity. So that's kind of my basic epistemological criteria, and it's actually a view, interestingly, now that it's in fashion again, that was presaged in the New Academy during the Hellenistic period under figures like Carneades. And this was an emanation out of Plato's philosophy, I think significantly. But I do take off from Schopenhauer, who was a Platonist as well, and who was also influenced by Advaita Vedanta, which I've also been influenced by. Probably the book that I've recommended more often than any other is On the Fourfold Root of the Principle of Sufficient Reason by Schopenhauer. It was his dissertation, and it's significant in the history of philosophy because this is the first time various senses of the term cause were systematically differentiated. Schopenhauer sets up the PSR, the principle of sufficient reason, as the genus, and he puts 4 species under this genus. The principle of sufficient reason generally is the idea that everything has a reason for being what it is and not being what it's not. If you abandon the PSR, then you abandon the possibility of explanation, and rational discourse collapses. Any rational discussion presupposes the PSR. It ends up being a kind of transcendental assumption built into all discourse. So underneath the level of the PSR, we have the PSR of being, knowing, becoming, and willing. The PSR of being has to do with geometric laws, basically, the laws of geometry, which in a Kantian sense are just built into our spatial intuition. One way of looking at it, and there are various aspects of this. I'm not going to summarize Schopenhauer's book in this. I'm going to use his framework to explain my own system to a degree, but I'll start with his kind of conception. So the angles in an equilateral triangle are equal, in a sense, because the sides are equal, but also vice versa. The sides are equal because the angles are equal. So this kind of simultaneous and symmetrical causation in the loose sense of cause, or this symmetrical principle of sufficient reason for the properties involved in any geometric identity, that's the PSR of being. And I'll relate that to identities generally, not just geometric identities. Things which have properties that depend on one another have a form of internal mutual causation. This applies to geometric forms. It also applies ultimately to conscious minds. Harken back to the video that I did on integrated information theory. The notion is that a system in which the information is integrated is a system where you can't take one aspect away without a loss of information of the whole disproportionate to that portion of the system which you took away. One second. So the guy who set up the radon detector for my home inspection had to collect it. But I was saying that if you take away a part of an integrated information system, that will destroy more than that part on its own should account for, meaning there's a destruction of the integration of the whole system, meaning the whole system gives more information than the sum of its parts. Those integrated systems in IIT are minds, conscious identities on the one hand. On the other, I would equate that to the true subsets in reality. The true forms in reality are integrated in the sense that as identities, they depend mutually on the various aspects of themselves to bring forward a form that is more than the sum of their parts, a unique form that has a real existence in its own right. So, yeah, this is equivalent in a sense to the Leibniz philosophy of the monadology, which says that basically reality is composed of souls, monads, things which, in the sense of an integrated information system, are fundamentally self-contained as identities. And then the PSR of knowing is basically the laws of logical entailment, how syllogisms work, modus ponens, the law of, or the transverse law of identity, various kind of principles in logic regard how we can justify rational propositions. So that's the reason for our claiming something to be true, right? Our ground of knowledge. But I would extend this further, and you'll see why after I go on a little bit. The PSR of becoming has to do with causation, and Schopenhauer reduces Kant's categories of the understanding to causation. He says that all of the categories that Kant sets up are actually really just cases, individual cases of a more general intuition, which is our intuition of causality, which is our faculty of understanding. So when you understand something for Schopenhauer, you grasp the causal connections inherent in it. And the material world and time is held together by the causal nexus, the causal chain. But Schopenhauer didn't live in a world with quantum mechanics, and he doesn't deal with the idea of retroactive causation, which we have to deal with if we want to account for the various experiments in quantum mechanics, like the delayed choice double-slit experiment, which seem to imply that once we make the decision of measuring a system which was formerly in a state of superposition, we determine where the particle or system was prior to our observation. So we seem to affect the past. And this can actually be expanded into affecting the past in terms of hundreds of thousands of years. In certain experiments involving gravitational lensing and a photon from a distant sun possibly traveling one of two paths around a black hole. You could look into some of that physics stuff, but we have to think about the idea of retroactive causation. And the way to think of it, also, if you watch my IIT video, Integrated Information Theory video, is the causal repertoire, which is that any genuine identity, in this sense, which is an extension off of IIT's definition, and I think an extension of Schopenhauer's definition of a geometric form, any system, integrated system, has a range of coherent futures and pasts that is arranged probabilistically. And that is determined by its internal configuration. So if we change the state of the system, we change its possible futures and its possible pasts. This appears to us as a sequence of events in time, one event causing the next event. What it is, in my view, which is consistent with temporal B theory, temporal C theory, and gets us away from naive temporal realism or temporal A theory, which is a real stumbling block for people, I find, in understanding philosophy past a certain point. The nature of causation is that the identity constrains the consistent, coherent past states of the same system and future states of the same system. We can model this mathematically, and this notion of the causal repertoire can be used fruitfully in modeling of complex systems. So given any given present Tx in a system where all the variables are described, we can, rather than deterministically saying what all the pasts and futures would be, like in a kind of Newtonian mechanics, we can look at what the range of probabilistically distributed futures and pasts would be in light of the nature of that Tx state, a given temporal state. And then the PSR of willing has to do with motive. Everything that we do is done because of some motive that we have. So I see a dog and I go out to pet the dog because I feel that desire to pet the dog. This is really just a subjective reference frame on the PSR of becoming, because the internal state of the observer here is an endogenous state of will, meaning it's a desire, a motive for behavior. And so once we have this internal state, we experience this motive, that constrains the range of our possible futures in conformance with the nature of that motive. And so it's not a deterministic, reduction to a single timeline, a single, like if I see the dog, I have to pet it. If you were very simple-minded, perhaps you don't have the degrees of freedom that someone who, doesn't just follow their every whim would have. So there are different degrees to which emotions constrain your possible pasts and futures. I think the more mediated your thought is by rational structures and schemes, the more degrees of freedom in general you will have. And this also has to do, the way in which our motives interact with our possible action has to do with that book that I've also referenced before, Henry Stapp's Quantum Theory and Free Will. And in that theory, queries that are made outside of time, multiple queries that are made all at once regarding the state of a given system, end up leading to, when a certain number of queries are asked, that the queries themselves, made outside of time, impact the formation of the possible futures. You'd have to read that book to get in depth on it, but the way that I would look at that, the way I would interpret that, is basically in line with my kind of monism, it doesn't preclude theism, is that God wants to know all truth, right? And so he has to know the answers to all questions whatsoever, including, like, if I look to my left right now, what will the state of some given molecule in this object be? Like, all the very specific kinds of questions we might possibly ask, God has to know the answers to all of those questions in order for his omniscience to operate. And so all of those possible queries, given the state of the system regarding its future states, those queries are God's queries in his brute force attempt to know all of the implications of logic. Of course, that wouldn't be possible. This structure wouldn't be possible unless the PSR of being was already baked in and fundamental to this whole structure. So, in my view, each material object, or what we take to be material objects, at its most fundamental level, is composed of something that contains the whole of reality, in the sense that it contains all of the logical laws. And if you don't buy this view, which is a kind of like fractal recursion ontologically, then you have to explain where the laws of mathematics, the laws of logic, exist in reality. My view is that they are essential to every object. They are the core being of every object. This is equivalent to the doctrine of Atman in Hinduism, the idea that reality as a whole, divinity, truth, the whole system of symmetries and relations in mathematics, all of those things are essential to every real being and constitute the most fundamental level the ontological ground of that being. And so the system wouldn't be possible unless at its base it was grounded upon some kind of fundamental simplicity, which we can deduce using Chris Langan's notion of syndifionesis, where any difference is underpinned as a difference on some system of syntax, some sort of law of the relation within the medium. Otherwise, the different objects don't exist as different objects. Difference is predicated on the same underlying syntactic laws generating that differential relation. And therefore, through syndifionic regression, we have to, if in any coherent system where we identify differentiated parts, at the very base level, ontologically, we have to get to a kind of universal syntactic medium where the laws of everything that comes later in the chain are already, in a sense, seminally baked in. The seeds of all mathematical laws and the potential of all relations in every system is baked in at that most fundamental syntactic level, which is fundamentally homogeneous, one, or else you haven't reached that fundamental level. This is the Platonic and Pythagorean doctrine of the one, and it is beyond being, in the sense that any particular being, like the law of the principle of sufficient reason of being, every being is an identity, the nature of which is predicated on this law existing transcendentally to its various components. You can do the syndifionic regression of an individual form, and it always leads back to the one. And the one is identical with the good because, as in Platonism, because why each individual system exists is because of those queries made by God. God is interested in all truth. And so every integrated system, God wills it into being. It's God's will. And to know the nature of every being, he has to constrain himself in infinitely many ways and apply limits to his being. And so he limits himself into every possible form to experience the truth of that form and ground his own knowledge in an indubitable way. Otherwise, in a sense, if we're going to anthropomorphize God for a minute, like God would be, if he had omniscience and he just knew what every truth was, would he really know unless he tried living it out? Like if God knows what my life would be like, or all the different ways my life could go, like how does he know that unless he actually gets down and does the dirty work of living through it? You'll notice this resolves the problem of evil, because in order for God's omniscience to exist, which grounds his existence in the first place, this kind of PSR of being applied to God means that all of God's attributes symmetrically and necessarily lead to one another. But for his omniscience to exist, limited forms have to exist, including those which depart from the laws of logic, which misunderstand the PSR of knowing, which involve causal pathways and volitional pathways away from an understanding of himself, meaning a descent into ignorance, Maya. And this value is baked into this system at a fundamental level. Hopefully some of this was clear to some of you. If you want to know my system, you should ask me about it. Not many people ask about it, simply because I think it is, I don't know, it's intimidating to face something that you don't fully comprehend, but that you recognize has value and which perhaps rubs up against preconceptions you may have. However, with regard to this sort of thing, metaphysical principles, the foundations of epistemology, speculation on the nature of reality as a whole, most people have no idea whatsoever, and they're basing it off pure intuition, or they just never even touch on those questions. And for some people, the impossibility of metaphysical speculation is their theory, and so, which is a metaphysical theory, and so, they're just kind of afraid to look at the question because any answer would necessarily upset their kind of dogmatic agnosticism, which allows for their kind of tacit materialism. Look at someone like JF. He is effectively a materialist, but also agnostic as to the nature of material, and his system is not a system. It all just kind of hangs together. Where JF goes wrong is that he takes the skepticism too far and doesn't set up a metaphysical theory. He just leaves it. Basically, he has Pyrrhonic skepticism rather than the skepticism of the New Academy. And Pyrrhonic skepticism by Pyrrho of Elis is concerned with basically feeling good, not being concerned with things because, well, what do we really know anyway? Which has a certain kind of value, I suppose. But the skepticism of the Academy, the skepticism, the pragmatism of Quine has the advantage scientifically. If we want to apply scientific epistemology to our worldview as a whole, we have to set up a metaphysical theory. And I've set up mine in part here. If you have alternative opinions, put them forward and have them evaluated. That's why the whole dialectic and discussion is necessary to get to the heart of these matters. And I think we'll get there. We'll get to the heart of these matters, and we'll build something important. But please do join the Discord, ask questions, and comment on what's unclear in this, and I'll make more videos about this system in the future. Thank you for listening.